Good afternoon, everybody. Take it people can hear me. Mr. Sherry Davian's nodding, so that's good. Good afternoon. My name is Mike Warden, and I'm one of the two inspectors appointed to conduct the examination of this local plan. I think that everybody today has already participated at a session or been in attendance, and therefore I don't intend to go through many housekeeping matters. We are here, though, to discuss matter 6, which is Dunton Hills Garden Village. But before we start, can I please go through all the participants and ask them to introduce themselves? But first of all, can I just introduce my colleague inspector, Yvonne Wright?
Good afternoon, everybody. So
Mrs. Wright and I will both have some questions for participants today as we go through the session. And you've met Annette already, and so if you've got any problems in terms of dropouts or any technical issues, then please speak to Annette and she will help you. So can I please start with the council, please, and introduce the people who are going to participate this afternoon.
Yes, good afternoon, sir. My name is Paul Shedderellian QC, acting for the council.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Inspector Phil Drain, Director of Planning and Economy at Brentwood Council.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Inspector Jonathan Quilter, Strategic Planning Manager at Brentwood Council.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Inspector. It's Tom Huang, Policy Planner, Brentwood Borough Council.
Thank you.
It's Simon Drummond. I'm Simon Drummond Hay from HGH Planning, and we did the viability study, which covers Dunton as well.
Thank you very much. Is there anyone else from the council? I've got Mr. Gebert. No.
Sorry, yeah, Paul Gebert from Stantec. So I've been undertaking the technical work for Borough Council.
And Margaret Theobald.
If Margaret's not able to introduce, yes, I would just say that Margaret and Paul have been helping us from Stantec on the transport assessment work. It may be, Inspector, subject to what you want to clarify at the beginning of the session, not necessary to discuss those matters, but obviously they are available if needed.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Drain. Essex County Council.
Good afternoon, Inspector. Mark Robinson, Principal Transport and Infrastructure Planner at Essex County Council, assisted by James Whiffen for any technical matters.
Thank you. Thank you. For Bellway.
Good afternoon, David Murray Cox from Turley on behalf of Bellway.
Thank you, Mr. Murray Cox. For CEG.
Afternoon, sir. James Fennell from Lichfields, and also with me is David Barnes, Mike Axton from Vectos, and Nigel Jones from Chester's Harcourt.
Thank you. And for Hallam Land.
Good afternoon, sir. Gary Stevens from Marron's Planning, acting on behalf of Hallam Land Management, and I have Ron Henry with me of Stantec, who's our highways expert.
Thank you very much. And for the Estates and Agency.
Good afternoon, sir. I'm Charlie Banner, QC for Estates and Agency. I'll ask my colleagues to introduce themselves because I don't think you've seen one of them yet.
Thank you. Clive Burbridge, Transportation Director at Iceni Projects, also acting on behalf of BA Strategic Land LLP.
Mr. Burbridge, I can't see you. I can hear you clearly. I just wonder whether your camera is turned.
Sorry, a bit of paper in front of it. I forgot. My paranoia. I turned the camera on.
All right, we can put your bit of paper back when you're not speaking.
No, it's fine. I'll just turn the camera off when I'm not speaking. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry.
And good afternoon. So it's Stuart Mills from Iceni, also Estates and Agency.
Thank you very much. And for the UNI group, please.
Hello, good afternoon, sir. Good afternoon, ma'am. Richard Kimbling, QC, for UNI Group, here with Mike Taylor from Chilmark.
Thank you. And for BPM?
Inspector, they haven't joined the meeting.
Oh, right. Okay. Thank you, Annette. And Wiggins G. Holmes? Is that the same?
Oh, good afternoon, Inspector. Yes, David Russell for Wigan G and East London. Thank you.
Thank you. And for Crest Nicholson?
Good afternoon, Inspector. David Carlisle from ACOM on behalf of Crest Nicholson.
Thank you. For West Horndon Parish Council?
Good afternoon, Councillor Colin Foam from West Horndon Parish Council.
Thank you. And finally, excuse me, for Highways England?
Yes, good afternoon, sir. Mrs. Burgess from Highways England, Special Planner.
Thank you. Is Mr. Walkenden with you this afternoon?
No, Mr. Walkden hasn't joined this afternoon's session.
Okay, thank you. Right, we have this afternoon and tomorrow to discuss those matters on matter 6 that we did not discuss on back in December. Seems such a long time ago now. However, those of you who are at the session this morning will be aware that as a result of a note that was produced by Highways England yesterday, the session this morning, which was due to consider transport matters, was only able to consider matters that weren't related to highway matters because of the need to do some further understanding of the position in relation to the transport assessment. So what we have asked the council to do is to, with Highways England, produce a note to us by Friday, which will set out a timetable and the nature of that work that needs to be done in relation to the transport assessment. So that meant that we were not able to discuss matters connected to highways this morning, and that will have to be done in a session that we will have to organise once we get some clarity over the work and the timescale. That also will have an impact on what we can discuss today and tomorrow in respect of Dunton Hills. But I'm hoping that the agenda was really that we would discuss matters related to infrastructure and viability this afternoon, and then tomorrow, infrastructure this afternoon, then tomorrow we discuss viability and the policies. But I'm assuming, and I'm going to look to the council now to help me here, but I'm assuming that in respect of the matters that we can discuss, we can discuss matters related to infrastructure that are not highway matters. We can discuss sustainable transport issues in relation to Dunton Hills, and I'm wondering also whether we can look at some viability issues in relation to matter 6 as well.
The answer is yes, sir.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that on viability, because the nature and the scale of some of the interventions on highway matters are not yet confirmed. That will have an impact on the viability assessment that we will have to return to when we come back to the transport matters. Is that am I right in that understanding?
Yes, you are, sir.
Okay, so in that sense then, and it's useful that Mr. Drummond-Hay is here, we will have some questions in relation to some elements of viability, which then you might need to, if you don't know, if you don't necessarily know the answers, then we'll have to return to those matters when we come back to look at it in the light of having the overall picture in respect of highway interventions. Now, some of you may be aware of that because you're around this morning, or you've seen the note. But have any participants got any questions in relation to that process before we proceed? Mr. Kimblin.
So thank you very much. We were aware from participating via YouTube this morning to see what was happening. And we understand that a programme is being put together. So 2 points. One is we wait to see what that timetable is. And the second point is as to how you then programme matters so far as they relate to both highways, infrastructure matters generally, and infrastructure connected with Dunton. So as to the first point, we simply highlight that the need to actively participate where many of these matters are overlapping. As you said, it's now some time ago since we dealt with matters such as trajectory and delivery in other contexts. And of course, we won't be repeating any of those matters. But what we're concerned to secure is a proper opportunity to participate at a point at which the evidence is fixed, as opposed to being a series of moving parts. So that's as to the first point. So as to the second, what we're particularly keen to secure in terms of programming is an a date on which we can participate in respect of those matters. When we will be sure we'll be able to participate, because there are limits to the extent to which one can repeatedly attend with a view to dealing with a particular matter. So there are many factors which we'll be taking into account, very many factors, and I only just raise that one, the ability to participate, as one to be taken into account when one comes to future programming. But thank you for giving me the opportunity to raise those 2 points. I have nothing further.
Thank you, Mr. Kimblin. I mean, you'd have seen the council's response this morning to the difficulties that they're faced with. We find that I think it's very frustrating as anyone in trying to examine the plan and have the evidence before us in doing so. All we can do is ask the council to do what we've done and produce a timetable and a process. But then we will have to ensure that that information is made available well in advance of a session, and return to a session that people can attend, that Ms. Feeney will set up. I don't know whether Mr. Shire-Davian has anything that you wish to add to what you said this morning for those participants that have just joined us for this afternoon.
I purposefully moderated my response this morning, but quite clearly there is a requirement for Highways England to do its utmost to come to the table, discuss and resolve issues as quickly as possible. And we are certainly hoping to do that as quickly as possible. We will know by in the next few days and by Friday what that timetable will be. And that's all we can do for the moment.
Thank you, Mr. Shire-Davian. Are there any other comments or any questions from participants in relation to that process? Okay, thank you. Can I then turn to those parts of the agenda that that we can deal with today, and look at the infrastructure that would be required in order to bring about the development at Dunton Hills. And so if I turn to the council, I don't know who is best placed to take us through this in relation to the to those key pieces of information, and whether that's set out within the either in statements of common ground or within the infrastructure delivery plan. But if we could have an understanding of those key pieces of infrastructure, and then we can have a discussion about what they mean when they have to be delivered, their costs, etc.
I'll be able to help with the question. Excuse me. All the items that are related to Dunton Hills Garden Village would be listed in the IDP Part B schedule. And the IDP would then set out the priority ranking of each infrastructure item, and whether the main funding sources would be via Section 106 financial contributions, or whether it would be a side cost for developers to cover. And it also set out a indicative time frame of when these infrastructure would need to come forward, and the delivery time frame is broadly in line with the priority ranking of these items. So generally speaking, all of the strategic or critical infrastructure would have to come forward fairly early as development comes forward, and the other necessary or place-making infrastructure can come forward as a later date. But these has been used to enable the discussion with developers, and it has been set out in the statement of common grounds as the terms that would be discussed at the planning application stage. And in the IDP, some of these items would be funded by the site in whole, and some of the other items will be funded between the site and other sites within the locality. For example, we mentioned West Horndon station previously, which would be funded by Dunton Hills, as well as other employment and West Horndon industrial estate. Sorry, that was my answer. I don't know whether you want me to go to list every item.
Well, let's. Yeah, thank you. That's very helpful. Can we, since you've picked on that item of infrastructure, and since we were discussing that this morning, can we just look at the West Horndon, the links to West Horndon in relation to specifically Dunton Hills? I know this morning it was discussed in a wider context, and I think Mr. Robinson had said this morning that the sustainable links would need to be in place at first occupation. Can I get some clarity on what needs to be in place at various stages in relation to the links to West Horndon? Because there is the West Horndon interchange, and then there are the physical links to the station, which will be provided, and then there are things like the demand responsive transport. So can I get some clarity on what that infrastructure is, please, and when it would need to be put into place?
Thank you, Inspector. I think as Ms. Huang was referring to, the IDP sets out timeframes by which Dunton Hill specific infrastructure is required. And as you'll see from the sort of indicative blocks there, that's certainly in the first phase, first period of development being built out, in essence, from now until the first block of time, according to the IDP, which basically means that certainly investment in key things that are listed there is required from the start of development. However, I think that there is a degree to which certain things are going to be built out over time, so that there's probably a difference between the line that talks about the connectivity with West Horndon Station, for instance, the upgrades to walking cycling provision, so that on occupation of houses at Dunton Hills as they begin, that those routes and improvements are in place, compared with the ongoing work that will be achieved at West Horndon Station over time, to enable the station to accommodate the growing number of people who will be using those facilities. So that is something that we're working through with C2C, is the exact timing of when that needs to be in place. But it would essentially be a phased approach, whereby we would be looking at gate lines, for instance, to enable passengers to get in and out of the stations in accordance with the numbers that would be required there. So that's fairly early in the provision that's suggested there for the West Horndon improvements, all the way down to new station facilities, buildings, platform upgrades and such that would be required to accommodate new trains, which would obviously need to be in place once C2C are putting that service on, which may not necessarily be from first occupation, but would certainly be whilst the site is being built out to accommodate the number of people who would be coming in and out of the station in that example. As we discussed this morning, we've also got the West Horndon Industrial Estate redevelopment that will enable the access improvements to and from the station. So that will, in a sense, deliver that improvement as part of that development, certainly early as that development is being built out, in accordance with that being the key, the main access to the site. So that is envisaged that would be happening early. So there are a number of things that relate to that interchange requirement that will be delivered at different times, but certainly the intention, as identified in the IDP, is that that investment starts from the beginning, and there are some things that would be in place from the beginning of development taking place at Dunton Hills.
Thank you, Mr. Jane. Mr. Banner.
Thank you, sir. The concern we have in this context is that the proposed development plan policies themselves don't have any teeth in relation to what transport infrastructure is required and by when. And given how fundamental that is to making Dunton Hills as sustainable as it can be, that's a conspicuous shortcoming. The IDP timings are, as you've heard, they're indicative only. They're aspirational. Their delivery is not baked into the plan. The statement of common ground between CEG and the council, CDF 17, about which you've heard a lot and read a lot, they of course indicate in appendices 7 and 8 aspirations about phasing and timescales, but again, not baked into the policy. And without that, they're subject to renegotiation and slippage. And we've already seen slippage about the numbers of homes that we delivered per year, and indeed within the plan period. There's a very real risk of slippage in relation to infrastructure. It's the plan, of course, and this ought to be obvious, but so sorry if it's a statement of the obvious, but it's the plan that has to be deliverable on its terms, and the plan that has to be sustainable in the sense referred to by national policy. And that means it's the plan itself that has to give you and Mrs. Wright the confidence that the necessary infrastructure will come forward at the necessary time without any get out of jail cards, and provide you both with the confidence that the funds are going to be available at the right time to deliver that infrastructure. And there simply isn't. You've just been given assertions, representations without anything baked in. You can't have that confidence because the policy itself, or policies in terms of Roman numerals 1, 2, and 3, they're in vague and generalised terms without specific requirements for specific infrastructure by specific trigger points. And I know viability is going to be dealt with tomorrow, and I'm not going to go into any detail on that, but I do just note in the present context that when you look at Appendix 9, the viability cost sheet of CDF 17, the Statement of Common Ground, the costs are spread out on a pro rata basis per year. And that surely is inconsistent with the necessary front-loaded approach that appears to be accepted by the council, front-loading at the earliest stage. And that adds to the uncertainty. So overall, what I suggest to you both, Sir, Madam, is that the plan as drafted currently in relation to Dunton is too uncertain in relation to the transport infrastructure, which is really fundamental given the location where it is at the moment, the lack of such infrastructure, and it lacks resilience. Because without those triggers, without that certainty, there's a really real risk of slippages and then habits being ingrained because of the lack of infrastructure and people then driving their car. A resilient, deliverable and sustainable plan would bake in an infrastructure-led approach from the start, and indeed would commence in the most sustainable locations and work outwards. And that's that context where paragraph 2.10 of our hearing statement, what we say is if Dunton is to be retained local plan, allowing for development of West Horden 2 would provide that resilience by delivering upfront improvements, for example, at the station, and an ability to provide new bus services and other measures. And that's therefore you can't, I suggest, treat West Horden as just another emission site and have the standard sort of response to emission site. It's about making the plan sound by remedying these problems. I'm going to now conscious of time, I'm going to pass to Mr. Burbridge, who's just going to deal briefly from his sort of technical expert perspective with some of the points. So I'll come on mute and hand over to him.
Thank you, Mr. Banner.
Thank you, sir. Well, Dunton Hills is currently an unsustainable location, and to address that, it relies heavily on the links to West Horden and also Basden, which we need to recognise, and the council recognised and conceded in week 1 of the hearing. The connections proposed to deliver these sustainable links rely on upgrades to West Horden Station with new bus and cycle links, pedestrian links. These works at the station and some of the links being considered rely on third-party land and the use of substandard infrastructure, as indeed Councillor Phone highlighted this morning. This brings into question their viability, which I know we're dealing with in a different session, safety and deliverability. As such, I really strongly feel, in my professional opinion, that it's essential for 2 main reasons that these links are delivered early and from the outset, and the policies are in place to secure this. Firstly, it's necessary to ensure that the works can physically be delivered, and I say this because if they're using third-party land or they're not safe, we need to know what they are. So we need to see the physical delivery of these works. For instance, West Horden Station doesn't have any disabled accessibility to get to independently to get to the track on the south side, the platform. So, you know, these works need to be done because it should be sustainable for all groups. And secondly, and it's probably of greater importance, we need to ensure that it's sustainable from day one. So when Dunton Hills opens its doors and the residents move in, they need to be using sustainable modes from day one. If they don't, they're moved to the car, and in my experience, once they're in that car and they're driving elsewhere, it's hard to get them out of the car. It's hard to move them into the sustainable modes. It's not that you can't, but it's just difficult, and you won't have such a good success rate. So I think from first occupation, it's essential that we actually have the policies in place to ensure we've got a sustainable community. And as the inspector knows, if it helps, my client controls the land south of the station that allows access to the platforms on that side, and allows and has also got land that goes right the way to the A128, which could provide cycle links, pedestrian links. So there is in the spirit of cooperation and working together, there is a delivery mechanism that can be had with the other sites also chipping in their fair price.
Thank you, Mr. Burbridge. Mr. Barnes has got his hand up. You did have. I don't know if you've got.
I've managed to crack this. Yeah. Hello.
Hi. We can hear you, Mr. Barnes.
Right. Oh, that's excellent. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Well, that's an achievement for me anyway. Thanks very much. You're going to be surprised. I actually agree with Mr. Banner to some extent. Not entirely, obviously. I couldn't possibly concede that much. One of the things we did do with the council in putting together the Statement of Common Ground is to think about infrastructure delivery and the items that would be required. And from a CEG perspective, actually, a version or the complete version of what's in Appendix A to address Mr. Banner's concerns about what infrastructure may be required and when it may be delivered can easily be incorporated into the local plan to give him that degree of certainty which he's seeking and what Mr. Burbridge is also seeking. So make that as a suggestion, as hopefully in a constructive way of taking the plan forward. I have heard today, obviously, the comments about the delivery of the sustainable corridor from the Dunton Hill site through to the West Horndon railway station. I think obviously people who haven't been actively involved in this as long as some of us have been will know certain statements that have been made in the public arenas about that particular link being there day one alongside demand responsive travel, etc. Mr. Axon may wish to pick those points up, but they have been made very clear as to when the expectation delivery of infrastructure in that connectivity perspective is going to be provided. I hope that helps.
Thank you. I've got some questions in relation to those points, but Mr. Henry, I think, has his hand up next.
Yes, thank you very much, sir. Just to expand on the point made in terms of third-party land, obviously works around the station and overcoming third-party land is achievable, absolutely, but really it's just linking that into the timescales and timelines of first occupation in particular. And I would endorse the need to establish the right infrastructure for the right behaviours and ensuring that from day one on site. But it's no easy task dealing with multiple garages, access points and other third-party land, let alone the works required to the station in themselves. So in terms of marrying that in with the delivery timeline, it's clear there's a misnomer at the moment in terms of matching that up. Also, the proposed improvements to West Horndon Station, how they've been represented in a slightly different way, it would appear as part of the recent transport assessment done for Brentwood. It's unclear really as to what exactly the proposed scheme is, with options presented in the Southern Growth Corridor document and the transport assessment. So there's a layer of detail there to look at. And finally, then, just pulling back to the more strategic view, really in terms of not just infrastructure and holistically looking at infrastructure, but holistic mitigation, be that hard or soft measures. And whilst you did acknowledge the discussion around sustainable travel infrastructure today, one does have to look more strategically and ask oneself the difficulties of assessing that holistic mitigation solution when we don't know what the full solution is for the development. And not least that only in part the development is being assessed up to the local plan period and not the full scale of development. There's clearly a missing aspect there in terms of mitigation being put forward, and the specific mitigation that we're talking about now, how that actually performs for the full development is clearly a missing aspect, sir. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Axon.
Yes, thank you, sir. It'll be no surprise that Mr. Barnes has already answered some of the questions that I was going to answer, but if I might add to his answer, is this, that absolutely right, that we're looking for sustainability from day one, and that is something that we can deliver as a result of this site. And it's because of the size of this site that we can deliver eventual sustainability measures in a much better way than if we were looking at sort of ad hoc, uncoordinated developments. And so if I can just run through some of the things that will be coming in the first early phases, sir, which you may already have spotted. So we're talking about the first things that we do are create the sustainability routes. We fund the station road, footway, cycleway that can be provided on highway land. We are talking about from day one the mobility hubs, the community hubs. Effectively, from the early stage, we're actually engendering the means for people to actually adopt a particular behaviour with the elements that we will include within those mobility hubs. We're looking at the opportunity to do some interim works at West Horndon Station. Now, there are some easily deliverable works at West Horndon Station, for instance, cycle parking, gate line, increased capacities. That can be done at an early stage. Also, from an early stage, we're looking at the shared travel facilities. So we're looking at a combination of a Zelo-style semi-demand responsive system that will run from Dunton Hills in the early days to the station of West Horndon, but also to the local plan employment sites as well, the Enterprise Park, Childerditch, West Horndon. Coupled with potentially demand responsive transport, we've been speaking again with the operator there, coupled with fixed routes that we expect to see higher frequencies on than at the moment, that will take people to, for instance, Basildon and Thurrock. All of these elements, as you've heard earlier today, sir, are important elements that we put in from an early stage in the process in order to engender a particular behaviour that then continues as the site gets built out. And I list those because those are that you'll see in the framework master plan that we submitted, F5B. That's embedded within that framework master plan, but I refer you back to David Barnes's comment that if it's necessary to do so, then of course those elements can be included within the IDP in that way. Thank you, sir.
So, Mr. Axon, did you mean it could be included within the policy? Or did you mean the IDP?
I did mean the IDP, sir, but if I can refer that question to David Barnes from probably a much better answer.
I did say policy, sir. Yeah, policy. Or incorporating into the local plan as an appendix, just given the size of that table. It might be very difficult to do that and then have a complete cross reference from the policy into that, and that is an appendix. Whichever way works the easiest.
Okay, I will come back to the council in a moment to ask them to comment on that. But Mr. Banner.
Thank you, sir. I wonder at times whether Mr. Axon was looking at the same plan as I am, because all the things that he's referring to simply aren't contained in the plan. If Mr. Barnes is now saying, I think for the first time, that CEG support the proposition that the appendix, I think it's 7, isn't it? I've got it before me, I haven't got the appendix number. Appendix 7 is well, again, be careful of weasel words, because an issue was suggested becomes policy. Now it's an appendix. Very different things in law. If it's not bold text policy, it's not what you're examining, and it's not development plan policy for the purposes of regulating any future applications. It's still not really something which addresses my point, though, because I mean, if you drill down into Appendix 7, taking Phase 1A is just as an example, because it's the first one that delivers homes. Phase 1A is over 6 years, 2024 to 2030. I think we're talking about 670 dwellings in total. And there's a shopping list of various items there, but no indication of trigger points. And my whole point is you need to be able to, the council needs to be able to hold a metaphorical gun to the developers' heads. And you've got to be able to deliver this by this date, or you can't have planning permission or reserve matters approval, whatever it might be. Because otherwise, we all know what's going to happen. Doesn't need to be spelt out, and it's got to be in the plan, because it's the plan that's got to be set. And I mean, I'm at risk of stating the obvious, but it seems that the obvious needs to be stated, and it's no good at being an appendix. And the other thing, which we'll come back to tomorrow, is if this is indeed what's now being offered, is some variant of what is actually being discussed today, which is policies R1, Roman numeral 1 to 3, but some variant that has trigger points, albeit we don't know what they are because we haven't been told, that obviously feeds into the viability session tomorrow. Because if there are going to, as we say there should be, specific things have to be done by specific times, in order to be satisfied that the plan is deliverable, you have to be satisfied that the money's going to be there by those specific times. Otherwise, the deliverability of the plan falls down. Where's that evidence? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Banner. Mr. Fennell?
Thank you, sir. Mr. Banner previously referred to baking in requirements in policy. I think the requirements in the modified policies are clear. For example, the works to West Horndon Station are now mentioned in B11, and they're also mentioned in RO1 2. So I think the policy requirements are baked in. Mr. Barnes has indicated an offer from CG that further information can be included within policy or supporting text about timescales. I think there needs to be some balance between certainty of provision and flexibility for a development of this kind. And I think if a simplified version of Appendix 8 in the Statement of Common Ground is included, and that will provide that right balance. I think it's also lastly worth mentioning that the policy for Dunton Hills does refer to the SPD and the Framework Master Plan document, which will provide more detail about those matters as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Robinson, I think, has got hand up.
Thank you, Inspector. Just wanted to clarify the sustainable linkages required at the outset should cover links to the east of the site as well as to the west, so not just to West Horndon Station. That may have been covered in some of the documentation, but I don't think it was mentioned by Mr. Barnes just now. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Robinson. So, Mr. Robinson, the County Council's view is those linkages should be in place at the outset.
Ideally, yes. Now, there will be, we recognise they may be less easy to secure at the outset, so, you know, we can talk about that position, you know, when we get into greater detail, but ideally you would have a through route from between Basildon and West Horndon, so that people can travel to whichever destination they need to get to.
Why, Mr. Robinson, why do you say they need to be there? You mean at the outset? You mean at the completion of how many houses?
Yeah, prior to first occupation would be our default.
What, of any house?
Yes, because if the new residents are going to be travelling into Basildon, then you'd expect them to be able to use sustainable means to get to the east.
So,
as well.
So,
I don't think the detail of how that link to the east can be achieved has been specified at the moment. So there'll be more work to do to secure that.
So, but on what basis does the county council? On what basis is the county council taking that view?
On the basis that if you want to maximise the use of sustainable travel, you don't want to ingrain use of cars at the start of the development. So therefore, you need to get in a direct link to the east as well as to the west as early as you can. Otherwise, people will have to use the A127.
But wouldn't you normally have a certain level of? When you normally have a trigger point in respect of?
Yes. Sorry, don't misunderstand me. I would imagine that there would be a trigger point that would be agreed, but obviously that hasn't been agreed at this stage. So the starting point is as close to first occupation as you can get.
Mr. Banner, please.
Thank you. So just two very brief points in response to Mr. Fennell. He referred to the focus changes. I don't believe there's any trigger points there of the nature described. In relation to his reference to the master plan, a future SPD, a future master plan or SPD cannot make an unsound plan sound. It cannot make an undeliverable plan deliverable, and it cannot make an unsustainable plan sustainable. It's got to be in this plan. Even if that it was possible to do that in relation to a future DPD, even not in relation to an SPD, which won't be subject to examination in public. And how are we, if timings and triggers are going to come forward in a future SPD, at least in part, as Mr. Fennell envisaged, how are you to work out now that this plan is deliverable in the viable sense? Because we don't know what timings are going to be baked into that SPD, and therefore you can't work out now whether the money is going to be available at the right time. So the two mechanisms that he referred to as being an answer to my points aren't the focus changes, and the SPD aren't on analysis adequate.
Thank you, Mr. Banner. Councillor Phone.
This is just a point I have made once before, but I think it's very important, and that is that there does need to be, as soon as possible, an access from or to the east of the site for health and safety reasons, so that, if necessary, emergency vehicles can get in if the A128 is blocked, which, with the increasing traffic that everything's going to occur is a likely possibility. I've made that point before, but I just feel very strongly about it from my health and safety background that must be recognised. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I turn to the council, please? And been waiting patiently. Can I ask the council, please, to respond to those points that have been mentioned? In particular, the point about whether the specific requirements and trigger points for the key pieces of infrastructure should be within the plan policy. I think, as Mr. Banner is advocating. And also, I'd just be interested to know about Mr. Robinson's point about links to the east and how they're set out in the infrastructure delivery plan.
First of all, let me deal with the point about what policies are and what they should be achieving here. Policies should remain flexible as far as possible. It's important in this case not to be prescriptive about what elements of infrastructure should come on at what point in time, normally by reference to a number of houses, bearing in mind that the requirement of the policies is that there should be a master planning exercise. That master planning will include the phasing and delivery of both houses and infrastructure on site. And there will be a separate regime of Section 106 obligations dealing with payments for off-site mitigation in terms of highways infrastructure. It is quite common and not at all unusual for major allocations to be dealt with in this way. And that's because of the regime of conditions which will govern the way in which the development is carried out. And the council will do that by reference to its infrastructure delivery plan, having regard to priority items of infrastructure, both on and off site. It will not permit development unless it is satisfied that key infrastructure items are delivered at the appropriate stage, and will therefore impose conditions limiting the amount of occupation that may take place until such time as those vital pieces of infrastructure are delivered. There's nothing unusual about this approach, nothing at all. That doesn't mean to say, of course, that the council would be unhappy to have a reference in the policy to a schedule in the plan that identifies indicatively when these items ought to be delivered. But it is essential that one assumes, in this case, that the council will undertake its development management decision-making responsibly by reference to the evidence that exists and by reference to the policy requirements. There is absolutely no need to be overly prescriptive in policies which allocate a major settlement of this type. At the end of the day, we are attempting to provide the basis, the policy basis for advancing a development that meets the requirements of the MPPF in terms of sustainability, and the suite of policies which will apply in this case will ensure that that is achieved. So far as links to the East are concerned, I don't understand where this has come from, I have to say. I need to take advice from those advising us on that. So far as these propositions about viability being untested because we don't know at what point in time these items are to be delivered, that is, I'm afraid, wrong with respect to Mr. Banner. It's quite wrong. Mr. Drummond-Hay and the promoters are very clear about what funds are available and when, and I'm sure they could say more about that in due course.
Inspector, if I can add in terms of responding to the issue towards the east of the site, I suppose, first of all, I'd say I'm pleased that there's a fair amount of consensus in the virtual room that these issues are complicated and complex. We've certainly found them to be, and so it's good to know that there's an understanding of bringing all of these things together being a difficult process. However, that process is well underway, as we've said before, and as we've set out in the Statement of Common Ground with CEG and indeed with other partners, whereby we're looking at bringing forward this site, the Framework Master Plan, and indeed our own detailed design guidance that we are progressing is relevant in the case where we are drilling down into much further detail than the policy considers as the policy sets out, and so shows evidence of us trying to work through these issues and indeed working with partners to deliver various pieces of infrastructure. So in the case of your original question regarding linkages with West Horndon Station specifically and how that works with delivery of Dunton Hills in this instance, that is where we have clear evidence of progressing those discussions with our county colleagues, as well as C2C and Network Rail in terms of the station requirements, and would certainly agree with some of the points that have been made about the sustainability measures that need to be in place from day one at West Horndon Station, and that's our intention through this work, and indeed the fact that there is no third-party land requirement in terms of what we're able to achieve when linking Dunton Hills and West Horndon Station. That's a principle of our South Brentwood Growth Corridor vision work, which looks at the existing highways land and the way that Network Rail land can be utilised to make the improvements that are needed, both upfront and long term. In terms of links to the east, it's not really in Brentwood's gift to deliver those across Basildon Borough land, and indeed will be relevant as to the delivery and phasing of the site, because phase one, as you will have seen from the documentation, is towards the west of the site along the A128, and therefore more physically linked to West Horndon Station, and that is why we are focused on making sure that links to West Horndon Station are in place up front and alongside phase one. Phase 2 and 3 then obviously, as they're developed out, progress towards the east and towards the Basildon border boundary that we have, and are therefore then relevant in terms of how we would look to link that aspect of the site through to Basildon in a way that's been described from a sustainable transport sense, walking and cycling prioritised rather than it being a vehicle access, albeit noting Councillor Phone's comments that we have discussed many times before through working up the details of this site with himself and indeed the emergency services providers, who will look at what is required, what is appropriate as the site is built out and what they require. So whether there's an emergency access as part of that is something that potentially can be delivered in the longer term towards phase 2 and 3 being delivered along with that access towards the east. But I would say that it's outside of Brentwood Borough. Therefore, whilst we can look at providing what we need to that boundary, it will require joint work with our county colleagues in particular, as well as Basildon Borough Council, to deliver those aspects, which I believe CEG have already underway discussion with Basildon Council about how that can be achieved. There remains further work to do on the timing of that, and indeed elements of the site that is outside of CEG's control towards the east of the site that my colleague Mr. Carlisle, I'm sure, can comment on, whereby delivery of that aspect of the site and land that they are promoting through the Basildon local plan process, which is obviously completely separate from this, would therefore enable potentially additional links that could be sustainable in that way as well.
Thank you, Mr. Drain. There's a number of hands up here. Mr. Banner, I'm aware you might have to leave early. Is that correct?
No, it's actually tomorrow. I've got my appointment with the Archbishop.
Oh, right, okay.
Could I while it's in the fresh in the head, could I be as cheeky and just respond to what Mr. Shadovian said? Because otherwise, what he said may have lapsed in the consciousness. Just very quickly, Mr. Shadovian said, he said it's enough just to say appropriate infrastructure, and the local authority can then decide what's appropriate development control stage. Let's just stand back here. You have to be satisfied, Mrs. Wright has to be satisfied that this plan is deliverable. We can all agree that is something you have to be satisfied of. How do you know that the necessary funds will be in place at the necessary time for the infrastructure needed without knowing what that time will be? You can't deal with the deliverability issue in the context of this without understanding what the trigger points will be, because the way the council puts it at the moment, if that eventuality arises and they then have to decide whether what's appropriate, and if they were to decide certain infrastructure is appropriate, if at that time the funds weren't there, one of two things will happen: either development can't happen, or the infrastructure won't happen. If the infrastructure doesn't happen, it won't be sustainable. So generalisation simply isn't enough. Mr. Trevor said it's not unusual to lack trigger points for development of this nature. I'm not sure whether he spent several months at the North Essex joint local planning. It is for development of this scale and for new settlements, it's perfectly usual to have trigger points. The one surviving North Essex Garden community, Colchester Tendring Borders, has the A120, A133 link road as something baked into the plan. Development can't happen until that is provided. And in relation to land to the east, it was said that the historian didn't know where that came from. I just remind you, I won't repeat it, but 2.7 of our hearing statement makes the point about the lack of sustainable transport infrastructure eastwards towards Basildon. It's no answer for Mr. Drain to say, oh, well, it's outside of our gift to do anything in relation to what happens in Basildon. That's the whole point of the duty, part of what we were saying before Christmas in relation to the duty to cooperate. It's outside their gift because they haven't worked properly with other authorities before submitting their plan, and it's therefore not been done on a joined up basis. That's all I've got to say. I'm conscious that I really ought to shut up now because other people want their turn, but thank you for your indulgence.
Thank you, Mr. Barnett. Right, I was, in terms of letting the council respond, there was Mr. Drain was, I think Miss Hong had her hand up, and I don't know whether Miss Hong you wanted to come.
No. I'll deal with just a brief response to Mr. Banner. We're not dependent upon a link road. North Essex is a very particular set of circumstances where the growth scenarios predicated very, very major transportation infrastructure and interventions, without which the planned growth could not take place. This is a very different set of circumstances where we are requiring contributions to off-site highways infrastructure, M25, and localized highway infrastructure improvements, which are clearly deliverable, and on-site infrastructure in order to maximize the sustainability of the proposal and alter the behaviors of those who are going to be living on site at the earliest possible stage. There is nothing critical that needs to be embedded in policy in this particular case. Nothing at all that cannot be dealt with effectively through the regime of conditions and the approval of a master plan and phasing and delivery plan, which will be approved as part of that process and will be conditioned. Mr. Banner's points really are all about viability, which is an issue upon which we can come on to shortly, I expect.
Thank you. Mr. Henry, I think, had his hand up longest, but Mr. Henry, then Mr. Fennell, Mr. Kimber,
yes,
and then
thank
Mr.
you very
Carlisle.
much, sir. And just to endorse some of the comments in terms of viability, obviously we do need to know the full mitigation, hard and soft measures for the whole site, which are clearly have certain grey areas at the moment. So it's hard to make an informed decision or have an informed opinion when there's such information lacking. And a sustainable development clearly has to be boundary or landowner blind in terms of what the right solution for such a development with such sustainability credentials that one would need to look not just origin, destination to, from West Horndon, which the main conversation is about, but other areas as well. And origin destination considerations should not be led by difficulties of land ownership or other. It's what the right solution is for a given scheme. Notwithstanding looking at the existing infrastructure available and the discussion we're having around West Horndon Station and the difficulties in terms of delivering that in a timely manner, which is our main contention with the 2024-2025 indicated occupations on site. I mean, it is questionable when the scheme in and around the station itself hasn't been progressed to a preferred option stage at this point in time. So it's highly unlikely a scheme of this nature, when you know the processes involved, would be delivered in such a timely manner. In contrast, you have to look at infrastructure in the area and consider the Brentwood urban area and upgrades as part of the Elizabeth line as an example, where a programme has already been completed indeed. So and you can use that as a measure in terms of timescales to get such readily made infrastructure in place. It is a key consideration one should have, sir. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Fennell.
Thank you, sir. In your consideration of this issue, can I ask? Well, can I just set out some references? I'm sure you've got them, but just in case, to inform your consideration, the first I'm sure you've got is the Statement of Common Ground, F17E. Point you there to paragraph 8.5 and Appendix 8, which sets out the infrastructure that will be provided and when. With the trigger points, and then 8.6, which sets out the key risks in delivering Dunton Hills, which you might also find useful. One thing that hasn't been, one policy reference that hasn't been, you haven't been referred to, which I think is important, is policy R013B in the submitted version and R013.2 in the amended version. I'll just read this because I think it is helpful and pertinent to what's just been discussed. And I'm reading the amended version now in F9A, and it says the phasing of development shall ensure the timely delivery of the required on-site and off-site infrastructure to address the needs of the development and help the early establishment of a cohesive community. Proposals should be accompanied by a delivery statement to demonstrate how that will be phased. And the submitted version refers to a phasing plan rather than a delivery statement. Lastly, can I just also comment on the link to the east of Basildon? It's incorrect to say that there hasn't been any work or any discussions. My company my colleague has had meetings with Basildon about that link, and the planning application for that link will be made at the same time as the application for the development. So please just bear that in mind as well, that discussions are ongoing with Basildon and they will continue prior to the submission of the planning application. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Fennell. Mr. Kimblin, please.
So thank you. It's a very short point arising from the word flexible. I entirely agree with the council that flexibility is important, and that of course is the nature of policy. Policy is flexible, and that's why we do our planning using policy, not law, because policy is flexible. But what you can't do is go backwards with policy. You can relax the way in which you put policy into effect, but making it more strict, requiring things which you hadn't thought of earlier, is something you can't do. And the reason I make this point is in respect of delivery and trajectory. If one is going to be sure about the delivery and trajectory, which I don't understand the council to be saying is flexible, that's something which the council's position is going to be achieved, then what necessarily, working back, one has to have policy which is going to secure, for sure, that which is going to feed through ultimately to the delivery and the trajectory that's predicted. And so, yes, I agree about flexibility, but I do caution, given the particular texture that we have to the policies we're looking at here, that there really is a very substantial difference between what one has in this instance and what was properly being sought, as for example in North Essex, where I too spent some little time. And what we don't have here is anything like the degree of fixing that which we need to get to the place which the plan predicts it will get to. So that's the point about flexibility. It's fine, but we need to be in a position where one is only ever going to relax from a position that is secure, rather than trying to do it the other way around, which isn't possible.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kimblin.
Thank you.
Mr. Carlisle.
Thank you, Inspector. It won't surprise you to know that I'm going to focus on the East-West links point. I would just like to reinforce what Mr. Drain and Mr. Fennell said earlier. Talks about East-West links have been going on for many years, particularly my involvement in the project. What I would just say, for your benefit, I mentioned it in September, is that the northeast of the site in question is within control of Crest Nicholson and Bellway Homes, and similarly it is within the gift of Crest Nicholson and Bellway Homes, because they both have control of land either side of the boundary. And one of the kind of key driving characteristics of our master planning for both within Dunton Hills Garden Village and also on the Basildon side, notwithstanding the fact that's got to go to their own EIP, East-West links encouraging sustainable active modes have been a key feature for us, and they continue to be. We participated in the design review panel process. Basildon were at that. Developers on the other side of the boundary to the south, like Countryside Homes, were involved in those sorts of discussions. So I think it's unfair to characterise East-West linkages as being an afterthought. They've been discussed for many years now and continue to be discussed. And we're heartened to see that the Framework Master Plan shows very clear aspirational east-west linkages, both within land that we control and also to the south. So just to put that out there, we think this is an important feature of the site. It's within our gift, and we endorse the approach that's taken in the infrastructure delivery plan, and we endorse the flexibility that's being discussed.
So are the east-west links within the infrastructure delivery plan?
I think that's probably a question for the council. But in terms of our own work programme, we see this as a key piece of our infrastructure. Should we be successful in getting an allocation for the Basildon side, this would be very important to us to front load as part of our process.
Inspector, if I may come back on your question,
Please,
apologies. So we're just checking with colleagues. We have not specified it as a separate IDP cost because it is considered to be a site-specific cost.
Site specific to another site, not Dunton Hills?
No, to Dunton Hills Garden Village.
And what is the nature of those links? It's £16 million towards West Holden Station, but presumably this is something much less grand.
Yes, we're effectively talking about upgrades to walking, cycling path alongside an existing lane, as I understand it, that is within Basildon Borough that would then link to the site.
What's the difference between a site-specific cost and a cost that is set out in the infrastructure delivery plan?
It may well be something that we can add to the IDP if that's felt to be helpful. I think we have separated that cost in terms of what things would be within the site boundary and what things would be outside, although I appreciate, as I'm saying that the link to the east would be outside of the red line boundary.
And have the costs of that been picked up in the viability assessment?
Apologies, Inspector. Yes, we think that they have been, according to the level of infrastructure that's required as part of the site. As you said, it's not a big cost, and certainly as we get into discussing elements in more detail on the viability testing, we're very happy to share with you the degree to which we've considered costs over and above what is even known at this point to make sure that we are very much aware of the potential for additional costs and that being viable within the overall provisions and proposals that we're making. So we are considering that to be within the costs, but it's not a large cost.
Thank you. Going through the people who've got their hands up. Mr. Jones, you've had your hand up for a while, and I'm aware Mr. Barnes and Mr. Kimblin have put their hands up as well. So, Mr. Jones.
Thank you, Inspector. Firstly, I'd just like to introduce myself. I'm the viability expert for CEG. I hope some credibility in this subject because I was one of the founder members of the RICS working group on financial viability and planning, and have been on the working group ever since. I really want to make just a general point, really, and that is that in terms of the viability of the overall scheme, I've looked at this on behalf of CEG, and if CEG and I hadn't really thought this scheme is viable, they wouldn't have progressed this matter in the way that they have in such an active manner, because obviously pursuing such a scheme is quite a considerably expensive occupation. So it's just a general point, Inspector, as to why I consider the thing to be viable.
Thank you. We will come on to look at the viability in more detail. So your input into that, Mr. Jones, would be very helpful. Mr. Barnes has got his hand up, but Mr. Barnes is next. Mr. Barnes.
I know. I'm just going to give up with this machine one day. I'll tell you that now. It's been a pain. I won't go into it, what happened today. Only a very quick one. On the East-West link, yeah, it is down as a cost of the scheme being delivered by CEG across land that they control, and as Mr. Drain has indicated, which also includes an element of highway land heading to the east. In the same way as we see the link along Station Road, the footway cycleway that's been delivered within the highway land, that's something we also see being obviously paid for by the development. There is a bit of an inconsistency there in that context, but from the point of view of the delivery of the upgraded link towards Basildon, yeah, that's very much a CEG cost, and it has been accounted for. Mr. Jones will advise at a later date in terms of the overarching viability approach that's been undertaken. It's not a particularly expensive bit of work compared, say, for example, to West Horton Stone at 16 million quid. We're talking a few £100,000 in the grand scale of scheme on the site of this side. It's not a significant cost.
But your view is that it should be within the infrastructure delivery plan, so that it's captured within the cost of the scheme. I'm to be honest, I'm easy way on that. If we go down the suggestion that we've already made of having some form of identification of specific infrastructure associated with the site, i.e. the table, the Appendix 8 table style approach, it is actually listed in there already. Thank you. Mr. Kimblin had your hand up next.
So I think that's referred to as a legacy hand. So you can pass by me quickly.
Thank you, Mr. Kimblin. I've got Mr. Henry, and then I'll come to Mr. Banner, and then I'll come to Mr. Drain.
Thank you, sir. Yes, and there was just a comment, I think it was Mr. Drain might have made in passing about third-party land requirement or not along Station Road. It was perhaps just to steer you towards document C37, the South Brentwood Growth Corridor, figure 13D to be specific, but I think it was endorsed by Mr. Banner and his colleague earlier in terms of the requirement for third-party land. So I would just direct you to that by way of clarity.
Thank you, Mr. Henry. Mr. Banner.
Just briefly to come back to what Mr. Jones said by way of his general point, I mean, the suggestion that it's viable because CEG say it's viable, I think it's viable, plainly it isn't adequate. It's no weight should be given to that. If the promoters' consideration of viability was relevant, then so too would L&Q's position have carried the day in relation to one of the unsuccessful North Essex garden communities. Also, in any event, does rather beg the question, well, what's it? And that's the point, because if the development plan isn't specific as to what needs to be provided when for this new settlement, then leaves it open for the developer to argue the toss at the development control stage. And that's a critical point. So I'm afraid to say that Mr. Jones's eloquent words were not persuasive.
Thank you much, Mr. Banner. Mr. Stevens.
Thank you, sir. Just taking a step back from the detail, looking at the latest trajectory for the site, the delivery of 1,950 homes, is reliant upon the timelines that we talked about back in last December, which are set out in the council statement, and it's reliant upon a timescale that sees the issuing of the outline planning permission in Q1 of 2022, so some 12 months from where we are today. And just taking West Horndon station and the interchange and the access to it in isolation, and East-West links as well, in order for that planning permission to be issued, there'll be obviously be conditions to be attached. There'll need to be a 106 agreement, no doubt, to be attached in terms of what is the appropriate contribution to be made towards the improvements at the West Horndon station. And from what we've heard and what we've read, it seems there's very little detail at this stage as to what those improvements are going to be, when they're going to be delivered, and the cost of those, and how that cost is going to be apportioned between the various developments that we need to contribute to those improvements. So that the point is that we have based on the council's trajectory, there's a 12-month window to the issuing of planning permission, but we have an awful lot of work to do to understand what this development is going to contribute towards those improvements at West Horndon, which we know are critical to the site's sustainability. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Stevens. Mr. Drain.
Thank you, Inspector. That does actually bring me to a point that I was going to come back on, so it's helpful that we're back repeating it. Mr. Henry mentioned, let me just gather where we are. Comments made about delivery at West Horndon Station. Yes, it was Mr. Henry earlier, and obviously Mr. Stevens has just mentioned it as well in terms of where we are with that. It's worth mentioning that in our conversations with C2C, that they consider that the station designs have reached grip-free stage. And once we are through iterations of that, fine-tuning that and signing up to a memorandum of understanding with them and Network Rail, as we've been speaking about, that would move it to grip 4 single option development. So I think, again, we come back to the point that we don't underestimate or disagree with the level of work that is required to deliver what it is we're talking about here. But our point is that we are underway on it. We have already, with CEG and others, worked through the Framework Master Plan document to consider what's needed on site. We have progressed the Grove Corridor Vision work and IDP associated work to look at sustainable transport measures, working with highways authorities and the rail provider here to consider what can be delivered, what that looks like, when it can be delivered. And indeed, that all factors into the application timeframes that I'm sure CEG can comment on. That they're already underway on. So we agree there's lots of work to do, but we would state that we're already started. And so we're making good progress on being able to achieve those timeframes.
Thank you, Mr. Drain. Mr. Shaldavian.
So thank you very much. Let's just keep a sense of perspective on this as well, this discussion, before we move on to viability. We're talking here about a few pieces of key infrastructure that can be delivered by the developer in order to make the development accessible. We're talking principally about a junction on the A128, A127, which can be delivered. If there's a need to factor its time into the policy, we can do that easily enough. Other vital links in terms of ensuring sustainability are those links to West Horndon Station. One can make a requirement for the contribution to be made at a particular time in line with B11. and in terms of making sure that the internal links to the station are carried out before first occupation of any part of the first phase can also be put into the policy if needed. But keeping a sense of perspective on this, we have to understand that the interventions which are required here are of such a scale that they do not need to be secured, as it were, through policy, but by the proper application of development management principles at the relevant stage, when we know better how the development is going to look through the submission of a master plan and delivery statement. But as I say, if there's a need to put in this particular hooks, they can be, but I'm suggesting to you that it's completely unnecessary. So far as payments to strategic infrastructure is concerned, we rely almost entirely for its provision by Highways England, and we have yet to hear from them as to when they would even contemplate starting those improvement works, having regard to the DCOs which they're now pursuing. 2.5 at the moment. I expect the Lower Thames Crossing DCO to be back on track. And we can make those contributions when they are needed to be made, but at the moment we don't know when those works are going to be carried out by Highways England. So all in all, if one strips out the strategic requirements, we're left with local improvements which are easily dealt with by the local planning authority at development management stage through the imposition of conditions. So that's all I wanted to say.
Thank you, Mr. Shodavian. Mr. Henry, you've got your hand up.
Yes, thank you very much, sir. It was just following up on that and a helpful simplification by Mr. Shodavian. But just taking the access alone, I know we will discuss highways at a separate time, but opening the door to the discussion around the A127, 128, I would acknowledge that a solution hasn't been defined there. The modelling that was done does show a level of queuing back onto the main line. And in terms of there are questions when we get into that extent of modelling, not least the quantum of development being assessed also, only partially being assessed within the local plan, which does leave, as I said earlier, quite a hole. So I think at this point in time, it probably is a little bit of an oversimplification with the key issues that need to be addressed to verify and confirm the mitigation required, not least simple access to the site. And these things do take time, and notwithstanding the point I made earlier about the station being a preferred option stage, and yes, Mr. Drain's right in terms of the GRIP process, but those remaining GRIP stages are onerous and time consuming, and we have not seen that reflected. We have not seen that reflected in the timeline set out to date, not least that Network Rail are actually changing the process from GRIP to PACE, which I'm sure will cause some level of delay in itself. I know Mr. Drain didn't contend my point about third-party land requirement. I would just add, sir, that I steered you towards document C37. I would also steer you towards the revised transport assessment appendix C, which shows similar third-party land requirements at Petersfield Way, Peter Close, etc. So there is evidence there to consider, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Henry. Mr. Shodavian, your hand is up still.
Apologies, I left it up by mistake.
Thank you. Mr. Barnes, then Mr. Drain, please.
Thank you. Can I just pick up Mr. Henry's point? I'm not going to get into third-party land in and around the school. I just want to again emphasise, as Mr. Drain has and Mr. Axon did earlier, there's no third-party land required to deliver the link along Station Road to the station. And the second point is, as we heard this morning, there are interim solutions at West Horton Railway Station which can be delivered in the shorter term. And at the moment, the viability for CEG does include a contribution towards those works.
Thank you, Mr. Barnes. Mr. Drain.
Thank you, Inspector. Mr. Barnes has made my point. I do contest that there is third-party land required in order to deliver the station road linked to West Horndon Station, whilst I'm happy to look at whatever is confusing things. In document C37, we have tried to design something that does not require third-party land.
Thank you. I'd like to, for the moment, move off West Horndon Station, and I'd just like to ask some questions about some other elements of infrastructure that the council or the site promoters might be able to help me with. And if we can look at education, and can I just understand what the issue is around schools provision, and clarify whether the requirement now is for a third primary school. I think in policy, in reference to, in F9A, I think there's reference to 3 primary schools, whereas I think previously there'd been reference to 2 primary schools. I just wonder whether I get some clarity on that point, please.
Thank you, Inspector. That is a result of changing not changing requirements, but the nature of developing the scheme in more detail. That meant that at the point of submission, the Essex County Council and ourselves continued discussion on what the relevant requirement would be for education facilities. So you're correct in terms of F9A being the correct position from an Essex County Council perspective, which would be 3 primary schools as well as the 1 secondary school element on site.
So in that respect, then the infrastructure delivery plan would need to be updated to reflect that provision. Just checking.
We think it should reflect the updated position. Happy to look at that.
Yes, it is. I'm sorry. It is, yeah. ED for new 3-2 elementary schools. So it would be the policy that would need to be updated. So in terms of Mr. Burbridge has got your hand up.
Yeah, sorry, it was coming back on one of the earlier points. Unless I'm completely got this wrong, it's my understanding third-party land is required at the station itself, though, and that's all part of the sustainable credentials of linking this. So it's not just about the links; it's about the station upgrade. So I might have that wrong, but my understanding is you do require third-party land.
Thank you. So in terms of the one of the things that we'll be wanting to look at when we look at viability is relating the costs of the key infrastructure elements into the viability schedule. So you should be able to see where those principal costs are and how they've been calculated and how they've been fed into that viability table. So the cost of the secondary school provision is £25 million at Dunton Hills, and the costs of the primary school provision is around just under £29 million. So we should be able to see those kind of figures in the viability schedule. So when we come on to viability, that's what we're looking at. What are the triggers in relation to those schools? Because there is what appears to be a fairly high sum included in the infrastructure delivery plan of around £23 million for transporting children to off-site schools. So can someone please take me through what the effectively what the approach is to the delivery of those schools when they would be required on the site, and whether that figure in relation to transporting children off site is correct?
Would you mind if I take the item regarding transport to school first? because that was one of the items that I have a little bit of concerns on. It's basically we sit down with Essex County Council's education team to work through different costs, and the idea is that all of these costs have to be based on a worst case scenario. And given that the site capacity can be delivered up to 4,000 dwelling units, so that's what we've been using to calculate all of the costs on site. And the transport for school here we calculated as almost 23,000 was based on the worst case scenario where all of these 4,000 units would need to pay for school travels. However, this should need to be we should need to consider that the site would be delivered to three primary schools on site and one secondary school. So this figure here does not reflect the fact that the site, not all of the dwelling units would need to contribute to that. So when, in terms of how this would be determined, it should be determined at the planning application stage, where we know about the number of dwelling units that would be delivered, and the mix of mix of the housing as well, because for example, house and flats would have different pupil yields. If we take that into account, then the 23 million figures would be a lot lower than what it is stated there. It's just the worst case scenario that Essex County Council is comfortable with, if that makes sense. And in terms of school infrastructure, what is set out in the policy is that the land would be provided on the site, and that has been agreed with Essex County Council and developers. And in terms of financial contribution, that would be also as a point of discuss with Essex County Council education teams, and that would be decided at the planning application stage as well, because it would it needs to factor in the quantum and the mixes of units that would be delivered on site at different phases.
Thank you. I've got a couple of questions in relation to that, but Mr. Barnes, perhaps you might be able to help in that.
Yeah. If this helps, sir, I assume you can hear me, can you, sir?
I can hear your lips aren't moving, but you.
I know. I'm sitting here very still at the moment. Just to follow up on that, the delivery of go back to the Appendix A to the Statement of Common Ground. The delivery of the primary schools is at the outset of each of what we call the neighbourhoods. So that's the Phase 1A, Phase 2A, Phase 3A. So that's the delivery of the primary schools. They are broadly being delivered to meet the capacity of each of those neighbourhoods. So they're there at the outset. What hasn't yet been discussed in a great deal of detail, I'll hold my hand up on this one, is whether or not they start off as a 1FE with a 2FE core, or you have go straight for a 2FE. That's something we need to talk through with Essex, that's true. And the secondary school is coming on stream as the start of the Phase 2 development. So that's about, I think it's Phase 2A off the top of my head. So they've been factored in to meet the needs. As Ms. Hong says, there is this element that there will be, up until the opening of the secondary school in particular, a payment for bus travel, hopefully by a nice green bus to make sure we're on sustainable, from the site to probably potentially Brentwood High School. That's what the discussions have been around. I hope that helps, but yeah, we have been actively programming when the schools are going to be needed.
So in terms of feeding the costs of the schools into the viability assessments, then has that £23 million for schools transport been figured in there, or is that some kind of net that is there in case the schools don't get built?
I can't answer that one question directly, sir, because the quizzical look on your face when you probably saw the 22 million was the same as my quizzical look. I think that's been explained as being the worst case scenario in terms of the IDP. In terms of the costs, what I can say, and Mr. Jones will go through this to Mr. Banner's delight later on today or tomorrow, or it may be Mr. E tomorrow. In terms of the viabilities we're working on, yes, we have factored in the delivery of the infrastructure costs in terms of the overarching approach. And again, we'll have conversations with Mr. Drummond-Hay, again, either today or tomorrow, about how he's looked at the viability on behalf of the council.
In terms of the cost that was fed into the viability assessment, all of the updated costs in the IDP has been used to feed in the further appraisal. With regards to the school travels, I think it would be more reasonable to use the previous estimation, which is around 9.5 million for school travels, and this takes into account the fact that the site would deliver the 3 primary schools on site by I think 2031, and secondary school, I can't remember the exact year, apologies, and also reflecting the fact that the trajectory that we put in front of you in F65 as well. So altogether, the total cost is around 142 million for the site. And when we run the viability appraisal, we consider that the site is viable, and the developers is in agreement that the site can deliver the required infrastructure and is still viable.
Thank you. Well, when we come on to viability, we'll have a look at of where those figures feed into the appraisal. Mr. Barnes.
I think the point's actually just been covered, Sal. I was going to make entirely the same point in terms of the viability and statement of common ground does seek to pick up all the costs that were in the IDP November 2020. So I'll leave it there on that point, and we'll come back to it later, no doubt.
Thank you, Mr. Robinson.
I think, Inspector, I'm just going to, I can't speak for my education colleagues at Essex County Council, but if any further clarification is needed around that cost for the school transport, I can get them to provide something in writing if that's of assistance.
Thank you. I think that I think there's a general view that figure is perhaps not the most appropriate figure to be assuming, and perhaps the council might like to go back to an earlier figure, or perhaps make it a little bit more realistic as to what should be in there.
I agree, and I can confirm. I can seek confirmation with the Essex County Council officers so that they are happy with the figures that that we revise.
Thank you, but Mr. Robinson, thank you for your offer of assistance. Can I just look at? I'm looking to the council really to just help me with the other key pieces of infrastructure, and we've talked about sustainable travel measures, we've talked about education, but there's also a requirement for an early years nursery, and I think the requirements may have changed in respect of that, but perhaps you could help me. And also looking at what is set out in the proposed revised version of policy, there is community health facilities as well. So is there anything you could help me with in terms of the timing of those pieces of infrastructure?
Just bear with us, Inspector, if you wouldn't mind. Thanks for your patience, Inspector. I think our response would be that those timescales are set out in the IDP as informed by some of the master plan framework work that has been undertaken that looks at what would come forward when and the relevant infrastructure that would be delivered at that point. Mr. Barnes may well be able to provide a bit more detail. He may not, but I'm just wondering.
Mr. Barnes.
Yes. Again, if I go back to the Appendix A to the Statement of Common Ground, it does seek to identify when key infrastructure will be provided. So on healthcare, sir, if you've reviewed the Framework Master Plan document, you'll see that the healthcare facilities being provided, the new healthcare facilities being provided within the village square, which puts it into a Phase 1A development scheme. I'm not going to give you a date that it's going to be 2026 or 2027, but it's a fairly early piece of work that's going into that. And obviously the council have discussed the wider implications with their health service colleagues. On the wider issue, for example, which is in the IDP on the Basildon General Hospital, that's very much seen as the contributions being made as the population grows towards hospital facilities, for example. Early years education, there is the proposal that the primary schools will have each of their own early years education annex to them, and from the point of view of an additional early years facility, that again, we think there are 4 additional early years facilities being planned at the moment. So one in the village centre, one each at the neighbourhood hubs, and one serving the employment hub. So there's actually going to be more than what's actually identified in the IDP. They may very well be delivered by private sector rather than necessarily public sector bodies, or operated by academies, for example.
Thank you, Mr. Barnes. So going back to points that made earlier, when we're looking at transport infrastructure, and the question to the council is, should there be any more teeth, as Mr. Banner put it, within the policy to ensure the delivery of all those elements of infrastructure that are set out in that policy?
So if you're talking about transport infrastructure and internal links to West Horndon, it's quite possible to include references to those as a prerequisite to the occupation of certain levels of development or any development. So we can certainly give consideration to that. That will include localized highways improvements and junction improvements on the A127 and A128, and internal links to West Horndon Station and the Section 106 payments towards that station. There might be other minor matters that could be put in as well, but it's unlikely to be necessary. But that again, sir, I say to you now, is a counsel of perfection. If that's what you want, it doesn't make the policy, in my submission, any more effective, because one can rely upon the Council's development management responsibilities exercised in accordance with the law to ensure that the development is phased and infrastructure provided in a timely way through the imposition of conditions and Section 106 obligations. But we can certainly give consideration to that. We can put forward some policy wording which encompasses that, and so you may then make a decision based upon the amendments you have, whether or not they should be promoted as modifications. So I'd be very happy to do that work, if that assists you. So far as strategic infrastructure is concerned, until we know when the payment's going to be required, and when it is, Highways England thinks it's going to be in a position to carry out those works, I'm afraid it's impossible to make any provision, and I don't think that would be appropriate in any event.
No, appreciate we can't. We don't know. We don't know enough about that situation.
So leave it with me. I'll take instructions on that and come up with some wording. I don't think that's going to interfere in any way with your discussion about viability. because costs are assumed to arise at particular stages in any event, and we can discuss those with Mr. Drummond-Hay and the promoters. So, I would attempt to get something to you along those lines, probably during the course of next week when we adjourn.
Thank you, Mr. Sherwood-Davian. Mr. Banner.
Just to put down a mark, it may well be that our discussion tomorrow can take place meaningfully blind to that forthcoming material from Mr. Sherwood-Davian. It may not be. So simply to put down a marker that if we feel once we see those amendments or proposed modifications that we need to say anything more about viability, we would like to have the chance to do so, because otherwise there could be a degree of prejudice.
Thank you. I don't intend to raise any more questions in relation to into infrastructure today. Appreciate we can't go into highway matters until we get the updated information that we need. Unless anybody has got any further points that they wish to raise, my intention would be to adjourn today and pick up viability in the morning, and work through that as far as we're able in the absence of some uncertainties about highways, and then move on to look at some of the detailed policy wording that we've not already looked at. So
thank you very much.
If that is agreeable to everyone, we will now adjourn, and we will resume at 9:30 in the morning.
Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you very much.
Please, bye.